Today we're going to look at the eighth and final of Jesus' Beatitudes, where Jesus stated, "Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." This is an uncomfortable topic, particularly in light of recent events which have happened here in Canada. And I've entitled my talk, Dare to be Just. Dare to be Just. This last beatitude is the only one for which Jesus offered a bit of an expanded explanation. And after saying, "Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven," he went on to say, "Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." And all of that is found in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 5, verses 10 to 12. This past week, we were horrified as Canadians when 5 members of a family waiting on the sidewalk to cross a street were deliberately mowed down by a young man driving a pickup truck, killing 4 of them. How could someone do something so awful, particularly in Canada? The police were very deliberate in declaring that the tragic reason for the murder was that the people on the sidewalk were Muslim. In plain words, they were victims of religious persecution. Here in Canada, it's a hate crime to persecute people because of their religion, and police are adamant that the murder was indeed a hate crime. What was additionally horrifying to me is that the young man who drove the truck was described by various people who knew him as being a Christian. This despicable act comes on the heels of the discovery of the bodies of 215 Indigenous children who were secretly buried at a residential school run by people who claimed to be Christian. The students at residential schools were also victims of persecution. Persecution is an awkward topic. Nobody wants to talk about the existence of persecution among us until they become victims of persecution. The rest of us Canadians have been squirming in discomfort while the survivors of residential schools and now Muslim Canadians have been given a voice to talk about their experiences of suffering persecution. As Christians, when we think of religious persecution, we normally recall horrific accounts of historical figures who were martyred for the perceived crime of following Jesus. Tradition tells us that of Jesus' 12 disciples, only John died a natural death. We have all heard stories of early Christians being fed to lions in the Roman Colosseum or being set on stakes and lit on fire to be human torches. I come from a faith tradition which claims Felix Manz, who was executed in Switzerland by drowning in 1527, as one of our forefathers. Surprisingly, Felix Manz's execution was perpetrated by other Christians who were angry that Felix was promoting adult baptism. Much more recently, about 20 years ago, we hosted in our home a Russian Mennonite pastor who had been imprisoned under the former Soviet Union for the crime of practicing his faith and was only released when the Soviet Union was dissolved. In numerous countries of the world today, persecution of Christians continues to be a very real topic. But for Canadian Christians, the topic of persecution for our faith literally feels like a foreign topic, because it's only in other countries that Christians are not protected by laws governing freedom of religious practice. According to the news items I mentioned earlier, the great irony in Canada appears to be that it is people of religions other than Christianity who are more likely to be persecuted. These news events lead me to consider a very uncomfortable question. Am I to conclude that in Canada, Christians are more likely to be the persecutors rather than be the ones persecuted for their faith? I suspect that the weight of that kind of distressing question is behind a statement which the Mennonite Brethren Church of Manitoba, of which our Flin Flon Church is part, released in response to the discovery of the bodies at the Kamloops residential school. A segment of the statement says this: as Christians, and more specifically as Anabaptists, we acknowledge our complicity in the residential school system and offer our apology and our commitment to do better. Christians throughout Canada agree that we have to do better. Jesus highlighted the uncomfortable nature of the word persecution in his final beatitude by highlighting a very particular qualifier. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, Jesus said, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Jesus' use of the word righteousness takes us back to the fourth beatitude, which promises, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Righteousness is one of those heavy theological words. Back when we looked at the fourth beatitude, I explained that there are two basic uses of the word righteousness in the Bible. One use of the word righteousness is as a legal term by which God describes, One use of the word righteousness is as a legal term by which it describes how God forgives people and declares them to be not guilty. Theologians call that, you may have heard this term, imputed righteousness. That's not the kind of righteousness to which Jesus was referring in the Beatitudes. The second use of the word righteousness is as a practical term, and it refers to the inner motivation to treat other people justly, to treat them rightly. Our treatment of others is clearly what Jesus had in mind in his Beatitudes when he used the word righteousness. Theologians call that use imparted righteousness. Imparted righteousness is the practical gift of righteousness which God places in people, which then enables them to treat other people rightly, with justice. 1 John 2:9 states this principle plainly when John wrote, if you know that that's Jesus, if you know that Jesus is righteous, you know that everyone who does what is right has been born of him. And you can find that in 1 John chapter 2, verse 29. So when Jesus said, blessed are those who are persecuted, the blessing only applied to people who treated other people with justice. More specifically, in the context of the seventh beatitude, which came just before, treating people justly is linked to being a peacemaker. I suggested last week that the seventh beatitude, which talks about peacemakers, might be the toughest of the beatitudes, and that toughness is highlighted by the fact that it leads to this topic of persecution in the final beatitude. There's really no surprise that peacemaking ends up being a key factor in attracting persecution. Peacemakers tend to place themselves between opposing views in a conflict with the hope of bringing these conflicting sides together. Being in the middle of a dispute is never a safe place to be. The letter to the Ephesians describes Jesus placing himself in the middle of a religious conflict through breaking down the dividing wall of hostility between Jews and Gentiles, and you can read about that in Ephesians chapter 2. Jesus' peacemaking work of treating all people justly with righteousness, well, that's what got him crucified. People who try to bring about peace between two conflicting sides run serious personal risk. Jesus' extended explanation of his final beatitude paints a picture of the kind of opposition people who promote justice face. Blessed are you, Jesus said, when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. That because of me is important. In essence, Jesus was saying, blessed are those who are mistreated for combating evil. Jesus was speaking from personal experience. Insults and slander hurt the inner being as much as physical abuse hurts the external body. But those are the weapons of persecution, and they are exactly what those who treat others justly with righteousness can expect to encounter. Any talk of persecution raises uncomfortable but important questions. One of those uncomfortable questions we do well to ask ourselves is this: am I a persecutor or persecuted? This question is not simple to answer. The Canadian politicians who paved the way for residential schools were convinced they were doing a good thing. Until this week, I did not know that an elementary school two of our children attended in Winnipeg was named after one of the architects of residential schools. The school district is talking about changing the name of that school. Immigration policies that targeted specific nationalities have been touted as good things. The Chinese Immigration Act in the early 20th century not only banned Chinese immigration to Canada, cruelly causing families to be split, with a husband and father in Canada and the rest remaining in China. It was seen by those who instituted it as a good thing. The implicit indictment behind Jesus' eighth beatitude is that people are often not only blind to injustice, they like injustice. People like to be in control, and when we exercise control, we are in danger of treating others unjustly. Nor can we deny that turning a blind eye to injustice we see happening also means that we tolerate persecution. Are there areas in our lives where we condone, or worse, promote injustice? Because if we condone injustice, we essentially endorse persecution. As painful as these types of questions are, they are critical to Jesus' message, because the only way I can fit into Jesus' Beatitudes is to promote the just treatment of others. In the extended explanation of his final beatitude, Jesus emphasized that righteousness which would attract persecution had to reflect Jesus' own righteousness. Christians are frequently tempted to claim they are being persecuted because their perceived rights are violated. But Jesus was always concerned about other people's rights and not his own. Jesus was the proverbial lamb led to slaughter from Isaiah 53, who did not open his mouth. The kind of persecution Jesus blessed had nothing to do with the violation of personal rights and everything to do with promoting justice for other people. Everything to do with breaking down barriers that separate us, that separate other people from God's blessing. Recent events have brought us to a crossroads in Canada. We are called to make a conscious choice. We can turn a blind eye to prejudicial persecution, or we can seek justice for the oppressed, which may draw the displeasure of some, but gain the blessing of God.